The understanding of environmental engineering. Your home is flooded and all your belongings are gone. You walk outside and you see a storm. But why exactly is this happening? Well, to answer that question, we have to turn towards climate change. As it stands, climate change is ravaging the world around us, and many people and places are currently suffering because of climate change. But how can we solve this problem? Well, one solution that we can turn towards is engineering. Engineering is a field in which we find solutions, evolve, and adapt, and engineers are able to do so. Now, what are engineers currently doing to actually deal with these problems? Well, some engineers are creating carbon capture, which can capture carbon, it's in the name. Others are creating renewable energies that we can use instead of burning coal or fossil fuels, which currently harm the world. And some are currently developing environmentally resistant buildings, which can, well, in the name, resist environmentally resistant hazards, which is pretty useful for the future. Now, the future is looking pretty bright with how many engineers are currently in the field and developing solutions to help better our world. Before we get into any major projects in the field of engineering pertaining to climate change, I feel that it's very important that we go over the history and roots of environmental engineering to start with. So, let's get into it. First of all, environmental engineering was never even called environmental engineering to start with. In fact, it was called sanitary engineering. It was only up until 1970 that the term environmental engineering was actually created and replaced the first term, sanitary engineering. Eventually, environmental engineering became multiple fields. At first, it was just one field that usually pertained to, usually like creating irrigation systems, but eventually it evolved into much more and just, branched out into multiple fields. By the 1950s to 1960s, which is usually where we think this usually happened, environmental engineering actually became its own academic branch, and it actually taught about air, water, and waste management, and air and water pollution. Now that we have briefly gone over the history and roots of environmental engineering, we can now get into the major projects going on in the field of environmental engineering and how we can actually deal with climate change. If we've gone over the history of environmental engineering, we can now actually get into one of the new technologies developing in this field, carbon capture. What exactly is carbon capture? Carbon capture is the process of capturing and storing carbon, usually in the form of putting this carbon dioxide under the ground. Now, originally this carbon dioxide was just meant to just stay there, but as of recent, engineers have found a way to actually use this CO2 into something we can actually use, concrete. Concrete produces over 7% of the world's annual CO2 emissions, which is a major problem. But due to the now newfound carbon capture technology, we can actually use this same found CO2 to actually reproduce and recreate this concrete, which is pretty useful. One of the companies that have pioneered the success for this new found technology is CarbonCure. CarbonCure is a manufacturing company that develops concrete via this recycled CO2, which is pretty useful. Now, the ways we can actually use this is we can use the same found concrete for new buildings, which can actually be a bit more efficient because then that reduces the amount of CO2 emissions that concrete production makes annually, which is pretty useful. Besides new technologies such as carbon capture, I also want to talk about new energy sources that are being used. This includes wind energy. Before we go any further, we need to understand what wind energy actually is. Well, wind energy is energy that is generated via wind turbines and using wind to actually generate this electricity, obviously. Now, wind turbines are, blown, and then the blades are spun, which actually generates electricity. Usually, this electricity is actually generated because the inside of the wind turbines have electromagnetic coils that actually generate the electricity when turned, but that's a different story. Wind energy is very useful because it's very self-sufficient and very inexpensive to maintain. Sure, the Sure, the setup costs can be pretty costly, but once it's actually set up, it doesn't require that much energy or money to actually keep up an operation. But there are some cons to energy, and I have composed a list of pros and cons of wind energy. So, let me read them out to you. Some of the pros for wind energy is it's low maintenance, self-sufficient, and takes up very little land. But some of the cons are they're noticeable. Energy transmission can be a problem when it comes to transporting energy from wind turbines to farms or to homes and cities. And energy production is very dependent on the weather, and the weather can be pretty inefficient, which is pretty much a problem. So engineers do have to focus on where they actually put the wind turbines for max efficiency. While cleaning up land pollution is good and all, what about our oceans? In this part of the video, I'll be going over the ways engineers have actually tried to deal with this problem and provide some statistics. First, let's go over the statistics. There's currently 5.25 trillion pieces of trash inside the ocean. Of that trash, there's 2,690,000 tons of trash on the surface and many more actually below the surface. But now with this statistic out of the way, what are ways engineers have actually tried to deal with this problem? Well, look no further than current innovations and technologies created over the past few years. Innovations such as the sea bin, trash collecting drones, and trash interceptors. I'll be providing a fact for each one of these pieces of technology. So, for the trash interceptors, as the name suggests, they are interceptors. They prevent trash from actually entering the ocean. This way, you prevent the problem before it actually becomes one. Sea bins are basically just trash bins for the ocean, where trash flows into the bin and then they are disposed of. The trash collecting drones are just drones that actually collect trash inside the ocean, which also reduces, plastic waste. These are the ways engineers have actually tried to deal with trash and pollution inside the ocean. With the developments of all these technologies, what can we expect in the future? Before I talk about the future of these technologies, let's talk about the future without them. The planet is most likely to see global temperatures rise by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, or 3 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, by the end of this century. While this may seem like a small change, in actuality it's not. In fact, this quote-unquote small change has huge global implications. Many habitats will be destroyed, and superstorms, droughts, and heat waves will be more increasingly common and more extreme, leading to major health crises and illnesses. While all that is indeed grim, it's still better to hope for the future. Well, what can we expect in the future if there's so much to hope for? Well, obviously, we have these technologies that can reduce greenhouse gases emissions. We have technologies that can clean up the ocean, and we have technologies to provide cleaner energy sources. But even with all of that, we still have to work harder to actually get these technologies up and running. So, the purpose of this part of the video is just to bring awareness to, the problems that come with, not developing these technologies further. After all the evidence that has been presented to you throughout the video, how does this relate back to the main idea I made in the first part of the video, which was, can technologies and innovations via engineering help save the future? Well, when I was showing you these current innovations and developments, the entire point of that was to show you how engineers have developed and refined their craft to help save the world. From irrigation systems to wind turbines, water cleaning drones, and concrete made of carbon capture, these are the ways engineers have impacted the environment drastically and have tried to save it. We still need to focus on the issue at hand. A paper written by the United States claims that of March 2019, we have only 11 years to actually deal with climate change before it becomes irreversible. This puts a lot of stress on engineers but not only engineers, but environmentalists as well. Fortunately, engineering is becoming more accessible via programs and organizations. Many say there is a shortage of engineers, but in fact, there's actually evidence suggesting that there are more engineers than ever before. Fortunately, the concern of engineers not being available isn't necessarily a problem, but since more engineers are joining the workforce, it does actually give us hope for the future. Engineering needs to evolve and adapt in order to deal with these issues that we face, or our world is just going to die. So, to recap this part of the video, this video was just a conclusion on the rest of the video to have you refresh on what the main idea and point of this video was.